In the dressing room in Niagara Falls in mid-November, I heard that Vince finally had been indicted by the feds. Then the WWF took another hit when Jerry Lawler was charged with having sex with an underage girl. My entire Survivor Series match was centered around Lawler and his constant jabs at my family. Without him, the match would mean nothing. Lawler was hastily edited out of the weekend TV show, with no explanation given to the fans, and Shawn was thrown in to replace him at Survivor Series. On November 23rd, Smith, Bruce, Keith, Wayne, Ross, Georgia, and my parents all flew into LaGuardia. Vince had invited my brothers to have a brawl at the Survivor Series against 3 masked wrestlers and Lawler. Now Shawn would be standing in his place, with Stu managing from the floor, and he thought it best that we have a rehearsal at the WWF's TV studio in Stamford the day before the pay-per-view. I got the Hearts, Shawn and the Knights, the one-time only name they picked for the masked wrestlers, in the ring to explain how the match would go. Owen gave me a nudge to alert me that Bruce had pulled the biggest and greenest of the Knights aside and was giving him a script the size of Gone with the Wind, with Bruce presumably playing Rhett Butler. I told Bruce the spotlight needed to be on Owen because Survivor Series would be the beginning of Owen's heel turn on me. After I explained what everybody's role would be, Bruce went right back to designing the match around himself, and I had to reprimand him in front of everyone. Shawn muttered at him, "If my brother was world champion and the best in the business, I think I'd quit fucking arguing with him and start listening to him." There was nothing Bruce could say in response to that. He shut up, but I could tell the reprimand stuck in his craw. That night at the Boston Garden I had a strange sense of melancholy as Keith, Bruce and Owen got dressed, while Stu sat with Killer Kowalski reminiscing about the old days. We wore Olympic-style singlets with no leggings, my brothers all in black and me, Captain, in pink. Martha sat in the front row with the rest of the Hart family, holding Ouya. Shawn did a superb job carrying the match, though in fairness everyone worked hard. The biggest pop of the night came when Shawn staggered past Stu on the floor and Stu drilled him with one of his big elbow smashes, which Shawn later told me he was honored to take. Owen was highlighted throughout the match and eliminated 2 of the Knights, but midway through the match, as planned, he inadvertently collided with me on the apron and ended up being the only Hart brother eliminated. After throwing a tantrum he left the ring, only to come out afterwards when we were all celebrating the victory to yank me down off the second rope and give me a hard push. I tried to reason with him that it didn't matter because we'd won anyway, but he still acted furious. Walking back to the dressing room with my brothers after that match was a magical moment. We all knew going in that we weren't expected to have the best match on the card, we were just expected not to have the worst one either. The Hart boys had more than risen to the occasion, and I was proud of my brothers. Stu had a twinkle in his eye. A week later Owen and I cut promos saying we'd patched everything up and were teaming up at the Royal Rumble to defeat the current WWF Tag Champs, the Quebecers, who were Jacques Rougeau and Pierre Ouellet. My fans would see this as a conciliatory gesture to keep the peace in my family, one that would put my shot at regaining the world title on hold. Pursuing the tag strap was seen as a voluntary step down. There was a shot in Honolulu on December 8th. Owen and I landed early that morning. There was no sense in getting a hotel room because we were flying out after the show. In a few more weeks we'd be bitter enemies on TV again. So I said, "Come on, hang out with your big brother and live a bit." That day I introduced Owen to my 2 surfer dude buddies, Christian and Tate, who offered to show us around. We hiked through a dense tropical forest, clearing a path as we went, until we came upon a gorgeous freshwater pond. Hanging from a thick, heavy branch was a long rope, and soon we were swinging from it and dropping off into the water, all except for Owen. Bobbing in the water I yelled up to him, "It's okay, Owen, it's safe." Grinning, he shook his head. "Nah, I don't want to take a chance on getting hurt." An hour or so later we hiked up to the saltwater pool in Diamond Head, Christian and Tate lugging a cooler of beer and a bucket of KFC. I took 3 strides and jumped into the pool. I kept calling Owen to come in, but he was so cautious that he wouldn't. I finally coaxed him out and we straddled the pool wall like a horse, while big, warm, salty waves washed over us. Hanging by our arms we looked out at the blue Pacific as little crabs scurried over the rocks. A pensive Owen said, "There are some at home who don't understand how hard you've worked to get this far. They think Vince just hands you everything on a silver platter. They're so envious of you and me." I knew full well that the business had saved us and that if we were back home with the rest of them, we'd likely be sinking fast. I told Owen I'd do what I could to get Jim and Davey hired back. Davey quit WCW after he had been extradited back to Canada to deal with the assault charge stemming from his bar fight. And Jim had already blown the $380,000 from US Air. "Someday we'll come back here with our kids and hang off this spot and remember this moment," I said as I leaned against the rocks with a beautiful red ball of sun blazing above the blue ocean. To hell with the diet, Owen, you only live once. The beer from the cooler was ice cold, and we devoured the last pieces of fried chicken. Blade, Beans and I managed to track down several invisible monsters who were holed up in my bedroom. Kicking open the door to an explosion of giggles and imaginary bullets, I crashed onto the king-sized bed, but, like always, I wasn't going to make it. As Beans put bandages on me, Blade dribbled some water into my mouth from a make-believe canteen, tongue stuck out in concentration. My dying scene was interrupted when Julie called out that we were going to be late. For the first time since becoming a wrestler, I got to celebrate an uninterrupted Christmas day at home. As we walked into the kitchen at Hart House for another Christmas dinner, Stu and Helen were quietly watching TV as barking dogs and hissing cats wove their way through a maze of legs, people and chairs. An excited stampede of nieces and nephews raced in to greet us. Our three eldest disappeared upstairs to play dolls or down to the dungeon to play wrestle. Life at Hart House hadn't changed much. Stu lit the stove and put on the tea kettle. "How's tough guy?" he gruffly asked Blade, who was struggling to hold on to Bertie the cat. Then we sat sipping tea while the variously novice wrestlers that Stu was schooling hung around doing chores and marking out at the same time. "Carl, darling, would you let the dog out?" my mom said as she smiled at me. Carl was one of the famous Leduc clan out of Montreal, and Stu and Helen had just let him move in. They always had a meal and a place to sleep for any lost, out-of-luck wrestler wannabe. It wasn't long before we gravitated to talking about wrestling, my mom pretending to make her usual fuss, not that again. Stu immediately barreled into a story about how, way back in the 1930s, this old shooter, Reb Russell, of similar size and personality as Dynamite, had been in a hotel room in Newark one night when a couple of black fellas climbed up the fire escape, came through his window and held him up with a straight razor. Old Reb tore into both of them, with one of them slashing his back as he choked the other one out. Stu said that Reb had prevailed in the end, tossing both thieves off the fire escape to the pavement below. Stu loved to talk about the tough guys of the business. In his opinion, Haku, Earthquake and the Steiners were the toughest guys around right now. He told me he liked the promos Owen and I were doing, and I could see that the fan in him was eager to see his sons take center stage at WrestleMania 10. The talk eventually turned to whether Vince would go to jail. My parents were concerned about what would happen to him and how it would affect me and Owen. I told them that Vince was too clever to wind up behind bars, and that when I had called him about his indictment, he had sounded in good spirits, optimistic even. That Christmas I received the best presents in the world, memories of the holidays to keep forever. I played road hockey with Dallas. Dallas also dressed Blade up to look like Razor Ramon. In his fake toy gold neck chains, with a greasy curl on his forehead, Blade announced, "Say hello to the bad guy." Sometimes I'd push the living room couches against the wall and wrestle Dallas and Blade, and before long Jade and Beans would join in, and it would go until I let all four of them pin me. Then there was seeing Beans through losing her front tooth, and a much appreciated one-on-one conversation with Jade, now almost 11, who looked so tall and slender that my eyes welled up as I asked her not to grow up too fast. At least this time when I packed my bags my heart was full. I'd had a great Christmas and things seemed to be back in alignment between me and Julie. Every week Vince held on to the belief that Lex would still get over, even though my popularity only seemed to climb higher. It didn't help Lex's cause when the fans voted me the most popular superstar in the WWF. These were my last great days as a babyface hero working in America. In the days leading up to Royal Rumble '94, Owen and I enjoyed our last rides together. On January 12, 1994, at TV's in Florence, South Carolina, Owen and I were paired up against the Steiners for a special home video match. The Steiners were generally happy gorillas, but they'd left a successful career in WCW for Vince's promise of even bigger money, which hadn't materialized. Rick and Scott were impressively built, both outstanding NCAA wrestlers out of Michigan. Rick, the older of the two, was generally more easygoing. He wore amateur wrestling headgear over his short black hair and kept a stubbled beard. Scotty had a mean streak a mile wide, but only if you gave him reason. Sometimes he'd be sprawled out on the carpet in the dressing room, and if either Owen or I made the mistake of walking past him, he'd hook an ankle and pull us to the floor, doing his best to stretch us while we did everything in our power to stop him. Luckily, Scotty was always pretty playful with us. One time in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Scotty had Curt Hennig tied up like a pretzel after Curt had ribbed him. For over an hour Scotty threatened to shove his thumb up Curt's ass, and the scary thing about it was there wasn't a damn thing Curt could do to stop him, until finally Scotty let him go. I brought Dallas and Blade to Royal Rumble '94. Owen and I decided that we didn't want our kids thinking there was any real problem between us, so we pulled the boys aside in the dressing room to smarten them up. I felt like I was explaining the birds and the bees. Dallas was both relieved and surprised to be in on the secret. I made them both promise not to tell anyone. It was important that they understood that Owen and I didn't really hate each other, because the business was never more important than family. When Owen and I went out against the Quebecers, Dallas and Blade were in the front row, and I was soon placing my shades over Blade's head. He accepted them like he should have been the kid to get them all along. The storyline called for the Quebecers to badly injure my knee, and then the referee, Earl Heckner, would abruptly stop the match, declaring the Quebecers the winners. Owen acted like he was furious because I hadn't tagged him in. As I struggled to my feet, Owen booted me hard in my injured knee, sending me crashing to the mat. The incensed crowd booed him out of the building because it looked to them like I wouldn't be able to take part in the Rumble. I limped out second to last, to a huge pop, and Lex and I eliminated the last two heels before facing off in a build-up that the fans had been waiting to see. After a flurry of punches, Lex picked me up with his back to the ropes and attempted to dump me out. I fought to free myself, but the two of us toppled backward over the top rope. It was critical to the storyline leading into WrestleMania 10 that our feet touched the ground at the exact same second, even when watched on instant replay and in slow motion by fans around the world. Lex controlled how we went over, and it was a testament to his skill and professionalism that it came off so well. For the next several minutes, WWF officials debated who was the real winner of the Rumble. Vince's popularity contest culminated in this moment. Pumping my fist in the air, it was obvious to me the crowd was mine, though the refs declared it a draw. When we left the Providence Civic Center afterwards, Dallas and Blade hid Owen under some jackets on the back seat so the fans on the back ramp couldn't see him. We drove to Stamford that night so we could shoot promos first thing Sunday morning. That's when Vince gave me the news: "I'm putting the belt on you at WrestleMania 10. Because of the tie finish last night, we'll have a three-way tournament. Earlier in the show you'll have to wrestle Owen first, and Owen will go over. But then Yoko gets past Lex, and you'll take the strap from Yoko at the end of the night with Piper guest refereeing." It had been 15 years since Vince had said I didn't have a big enough name to wrestle at Madison Square Garden. I'd already won the Intercontinental belt there, and now it was sweet vindication to hear this very same man tell me that I was going to regain the World Heavyweight Championship there too. Over the next few weeks, Owen and I did intense, realistic interviews in which I did my best to sound like a big brother who was sorry it had all come to this, while Owen came across as a jealous hothead trying to knock his older brother off his perch. With Taker off, the storyline was that he died in a much-hyped coffin match, but in fact Vince had given Mark time off because his wife was pregnant, and Yoko spent. Our angle took the forefront of Vince's booking. The card for WrestleMania 10 was shaping up to have fewer celebrities than previous years. With the negative press about Vince's steroid trial, the WWF had become a dirty word. Vince lost significant sponsors and TV slots in major markets, and WCW, with financial backing from Turner Broadcasting, could afford to gobble them up, and did. February began with a tour to Austria, Germany, and Israel. I knew from the mood on the flight over that somebody was going to screw up and lose their job. The Steiners had been trying to get out of their contract so they could go back to WCW, where a better paying deal with a much lighter schedule was on the table. Vince wouldn't release them, so they began intentionally roughing up some of the TV job boys, forcing him to change his mind. It looked like this European tour would be the last hurrah for the Steiners in the WWF. On the first day of the tour, Marty Jannetty locked the driver out of the bus and was about to drive off with all of us. Many of the boys cheered him on, but when Marty looked at me for encouragement, all I could say was, "Not one of those guys will help you when they fire you again, Marty." He immediately put on the brakes. He shook my hand and thanked me, then opened the door for the driver and took his seat. Everywhere we went, hysterical fans beat on the windows and ran alongside the bus, chanting, "Hitman! Hitman!" I saw what it meant to these fans for me to be their hero, which caused it to mean even more to me. I couldn't believe that somehow I was bigger than ever in Germany. That year I was paid the tremendous compliment of receiving my third Bravo Award in as many years for being their #1 sports hero. I was grateful for the special amenities from the European promoters and tour managers, who made sure I had the best hotel suites. There was often a complimentary bottle of red wine or chilled champagne waiting for me when I walked in. In Dortmund I had a marble whirlpool, antique brass bed, a splendid balcony view of the city, and temptation knocking at my door. One of my regular Fräulein was standing there looking sexy as hell in high-heeled black boots, tight blue jeans and a black leather biker jacket. But the bus was leaving the hotel really early the next morning. I was simply too tired. I went to bed alone and then lay there staring at the ceiling. I knew Julie would have a hard time appreciating that I had just said no to a stunning, black-haired 22-year-old vixen with pouty lips and long legs. While checking out of the hotel at 4:30 a.m., I saw the tour manager, an efficient, serious little Scotsman named Jake, doing his best to sort out the wrestlers' unpaid bills. Marty Jannetty, drunken and red-eyed, was barely able to stay standing as Jake tried to go over his bill with him. Scotty Steiner steamed across the lobby, ripped the bill out of Jake's hand and slapped it on the front desk, pinning it with one finger of his right hand while with his left hand he put a finger to his nostril and blew a nasty green snot across it. By the time we landed in Rome to make our connection to Israel, Marty had been fired again and was already on a plane home. After clearing the heavily secured airport in Tel Aviv, I spent most of the day sleeping in my room at the Holiday Inn on Hayarkon Street. That night I had a cold bottle of Gold Star beer in my hand at a cool disco built in the ruins of a building that had been hit by a Scud missile during the Gulf War. It had no roof, and I felt like I was back at the Alamo. A moonlit sky and a balmy Mediterranean breeze made for a perfect night. I downed a long gulp. It was impossible not to notice how bold, beautiful and direct the Israeli women were. I hung out for a while but left early so I could be rested for an early morning guided tour of Jerusalem that the promoter had set up for me. Dorit, my guide, quickly figured out that I have a fascination with history. I was amazed that she'd never even heard of pro wrestling. We came from two completely different worlds. Accompanying us on the hour-long ride to Jerusalem were a driver and two security guards who wore several pistols each, strapped to various parts of their bodies. Dorit was an expert on the history of the region based on historical facts, not religious teachings. She told me that Jerusalem means city of peace in Hebrew and described it as the center of the civilized world, the promised land, with a history going back 4,000 years. As we got closer to Jerusalem I studied the rounded gold dome I could see off in the distance, against a pale blue sky dotted with white clouds. The Dome of the Rock is the holiest place for Muslims after Mecca. As I entered I was abruptly snatched by the wrist by a long, tall, gangly Arab version of Abe Lincoln with bushy black eyebrows, thick, muscled forearms and huge, strong hands. He bared his white teeth. "Come, you wrestle me now." I had a tough time getting free and suspected that this wiry old fellow had milked a lot of camels in his day. I had an unsettling image of the two of us rolling around, a tangle of arms and legs, Arab Abe putting me in a camel clutch. This was his home turf. Surely Allah would side with him. It was a serious standoff, and I didn't take it lightly, because wrestlers were expected to be as tough as they were on TV at all times. I was relieved when a stunned Dorit snapped at him to leave me alone and shoot him off. So much for his dream of beating the hitman. Soon I was looking up at the high white stone of the Wailing Wall. I scribbled a small prayer on a slip of paper. "Please God, get me home." I stuck it up high next to thousands of others, in the cracks between the huge stone blocks. Then we made our way across an open plaza, and I looked up to see a group of Israeli soldiers with machine guns slung over their shoulders casually leaning against a couple of parked jeeps. Dorit and my security guards froze with fear upon hearing what sounded like a small stampede behind us, and the soldiers jumped to attention, cocking their guns. A sigh broke out across the plaza as I was suddenly mobbed by 40 or 50 Israeli schoolchildren who couldn't believe it was me. Some were on their knees kissing my hands as the rest chanted, "Hitman! Hitman!" The soldiers recognized me too. I signed autographs and posed for photos with the soldiers next to their jeeps. It made me uncomfortable to be idolized in such a holy place, and Dorit simply couldn't believe what was happening. At our next stop, we retraced the path along the Via Dolorosa that Jesus took as he carried his cross to the place of execution. Dorit said that when astronaut Neil Armstrong visited the city and was told that these were the very steps that Jesus climbed on his way to Golgotha, Armstrong said that it was harder for him to climb these steps than it was for him to walk on the moon. I was particularly amazed by the imprint of a human hand in a white stone wall. Dorit told me it was said that Jesus leaned there while carrying the cross. My hand fit inside that imprint. We went on to the Dead Sea. We all stripped down to our underwear, even the security guards, and waded in, with Dorit cautioning me not to get the salty water in my eyes. I floated like a cork, awkwardly at first, but then I realized it really was impossible to sink in the waist-high water. It felt like I was floating in an invisible chair. The water burned and tingled my little scratches and mat burns, and especially my skinned-up shins, which had been scabbed up for years from all the front turnbuckles I'd taken. Smearing the mud from the sea bottom on my cuts healed them almost instantly. We then went for a drive high into the rocky cliffs that overlook the Dead Sea, with the desert of Jordan visible on the other side. I took a position along a ledge of rock where below me 3 beautiful brown eagles crisscrossed the sky. As I sat there I remembered the time Julie's sister, Sandy, asked me what animal I would be if I could choose. After much deliberation, I told her a lion, because they were certainly the toughest, being the king of the jungle. They're agile and they love their cubs. She asked me for a second choice, and I told her an eagle, for much the same reasons. The third choice? After much thought I said a polar bear, because of their perseverance in surviving the fiercest cold, and doing it all alone. Sandy explained that my first choice, the lion, was how I wanted people to see me. The second choice was how they did actually see me. The third choice, however, was what I really was inside. Thinking on that, I stared down into the cavernous rocky cliffs with the soaring eagles, and I prayed to God to help me hold on for just a little longer. With his help I would not end up as a polar bear, cold and lonely, or as a wrestling tragedy, bitter and broken. That night as I took on Yoko, Jewish and Arab kids sat together cheering me on. Yoko accidentally came down too hard on me and my nose spawned a river of blood that I defiantly wiped away. I made my comeback with poor old Mr. Fuji taking forever to climb up on the apron with his bad knees, clinging to his Japanese flag on a pole. I grabbed Fuji by the collar of his kimono and waited for him to say now, so I could magically move out of the way of the charging Yokozuna, who was coming at me from behind. 1, 2, 3. Jerusalem. My heart was full as I looked out at all the happy faces. I arranged for all the wrestlers to take a similar bus tour the next morning while Dorit took me back to Jerusalem. After another inspiring day spent exploring the city, I arrived at the building in Tel Aviv to wrestle Yoko again. When I saw Randy and Owen, they looked like someone had turned a light on in the back of their heads. Randy shook my hand, thanking me over and over for telling him to go on the tour. And Owen told me he wrote a prayer about getting home safely to Martha and Uya and put it in the Wailing Wall. I told him I'd done the same thing. After the show I went to a hotel bar right on the beach, where I struck it rich with an enchanting beauty. To her I was a welcome distraction from the never-ending violence. We strolled along the beach, lit by a full moon. The beach still bore the scars of being pounded with Iraqi missiles. It was a warm night. Salty green waves rolled up to our feet. She walked me to my hotel room and eagerly pinned me to my door with sweet kisses. I thought I could fall in love with this girl. "Thou shalt lead us not into temptation" was floating around in my head. I settled for one last kiss. As she walked slowly away down the beach, my heart pounded with regret. "I'll be back," I called out. She turned for a moment and smiled at me. Within a couple of days, I was back in Frankfurt, Germany, one of my all-time best towns in terms of fan reaction. After the match I climbed onto the Babyface bus and flopped down into a plush seat. The driver answered calls from the back to turn on a porno movie for the short ride back to the hotel. Scotty Steiner was picking on Tiger Jackson again. The Steiners wouldn't be gone soon enough for poor Tiger, who meekly pulled his cap off and tucked his chin in, like a sad little ghoul, so that Scotty could slobber on two of his fingers and slap Tiger hard on the top of his bald head. Tiger had learned from too much experience, if he didn't cooperate by taking his hat off, Scotty would hit him in the head 10 times. Tiger was 35 years old, proud, with a lovely wife at home. He took his punishment without saying a word. I had told Scotty he was a better man than to pick on a midget. He always agreed, but that never stopped him. The wrestling business was and always will be filled with bullies, who stripped down and dressed right beside the backstabber, who was next to the clumsy oaf who didn't mean to hurt you, next to the worker you could trust with your body and your life. Someone interrupted the porno movie and popped in an Ultimate Fighting tape. Most of the boys got to comparing Ultimate Fighters to pro wrestlers. The UFC guys pounded each other's face and snapped limbs for real, all for a measly $50,000 grand prize. I was proud that wrestling was a work. I got to thinking what a strange life I led. I'd said I'd get out of wrestling after 5 years to go home and be normal, but that was 20 years ago now, and this vagabond odyssey had long since become the only normal I knew. My house was bought and paid for, and there were 2 new cars in my garage. The thought of my kids growing up so fast made me promise myself I'd get home in 3 more years. By then I'd be 40. It was hard to believe that in a few days I'd be back in Calgary. I envisioned myself pacing around the pool with the stereo blasting and a tape of my matches on with the sound turned down. I didn't need to hear the hype. I just needed to think about everything. WrestleMania 10